the first time Florence Conley walked into Redemption Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1882, every man in the Silver Spur Saloon stopped talking long enough to watch the dust settle behind her boots, and not one of them thought to ask where she had come from, or what she was carrying in that battered leather satchel pressed tight against her ribs like it held the last good thing left in the world. She was not a beautiful woman in the way that stopped hearts outright. She was something more complicated than that. Tall enough to look most men level in the eye, with dark auburn hair that she kept pinned but never quite tamed, and a pair of green eyes that had seen more than a woman of 26 years had any reasonable right to see. Her dress was clean but travel-worn, a deep charcoal gray with a white collar that had been pressed and repressed until the fabric was starting to thin at the edges. She wore no jewelry except a thin brass ring on her right hand, not her left, which meant something to those who paid attention to such details. Nobody in Redemption Creek paid attention to such details. Nobody, that is, except Silas Slater. He was sitting at a corner table alone, which was unusual for the owner of the largest cattle ranch within 40 miles in any direction. Silas Slater was 32 years old, broad-shouldered in the way that comes from 20 years of actual physical labor rather than any notion of vanity, with dark brown hair that curled slightly at the temples where the sweat had dried from his afternoon ride. He had a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same limestone that made up the hills north of town, and eyes the color of creek water in late summer, somewhere between brown and gold depending on the light. He was handsome in a rough, unpolished way that he himself seemed entirely unaware of, which was part of what made him different from the rest of the men in Redemption Creek. He had a glass of whiskey in front of him that he had been nursing for the better part of an hour, and he was watching the room not with the predatory laziness of a man looking for trouble or company, but with the quiet, careful attention of someone who had made a habit out of noticing things other people missed. He noticed the satchel first. It was the way she held it, close and angled slightly inward, the way a person carries something irreplaceable rather than merely valuable. He noticed that her boots had recently been resoled, which meant she had money enough for basic repairs but had been walking hard distances. He noticed that she scanned the room in a specific pattern, not the sweeping gaze of curiosity, but the methodical survey of someone looking for threats, exits, and faces she might already know. She found none of the last, visibly relaxed half a fraction, and walked to the bar with the measured confidence of someone who had learned the hard way that showing uncertainty in a strange town was an invitation for trouble. Silas watched her order a glass of water and ask Hector Briggs, the bartender, if there was a boarding house in town. "Mrs. Calloway runs a place 2 streets east," Hector said, not unkindly, "but it's full up since the railroad men came through last week. You might try the church hall. Pastor Whitmore sometimes lets rooms." "I am not much for charity," she said, and her voice carried a quiet, clear dignity that made Hector straighten up a little without appearing to notice that he was doing it. "I did not say it was charity," Hector replied. "It is 20 cents a night, same as anywhere else." She considered this. "Thank you," she said, and drank her water. It was Silas Slater who stood up from his corner table and walked to the bar, not with the swagger of a man who had decided to involve himself where he was not wanted, but with the calm, unhurried movement of someone who had simply decided to be somewhere and saw no reason to make a production of the decision. He set his empty glass on the bar next to hers and said, to no one in particular and to her in specific, "Pastor Whitmore is a decent man, but the church hall smells of mildew from October to April, and it is not yet warm enough for that to have cleared. Mrs. Calloway's will have a vacancy by Friday when the last of the railroad surveyors moves on. There is also a room above the general store that Clem Hadley rents out, if you need something immediate." She turned and looked at him with the kind of directness that most people found uncomfortable. "Are you in the habit of offering lodging advice to strangers?" "I am in the habit of knowing things about my town," he said, meeting her gaze without flinching from it, and I noticed you looked like someone who needed accurate information rather than convenient fiction." There was a beat of silence. "Silas Slater," he said, and offered his hand. She looked at the hand for a moment, not with suspicion exactly, but with the careful assessment of someone who had learned to read palms for the history written in them rather than the future. She took it. "Florence Conley. What brings you to Redemption Creek, Miss Conley?" She glanced at the ring on her right hand, a gesture so small and automatic that he almost missed it. "Mrs. Conley," she said, though the Mrs. is something of a recent complication. It was, Silas Slater thought, the most honest non-answer he had heard in a long while. And instead of filling the silence with one of the dozen social responses that a man in his position might have reached for, he simply nodded and said, "I am sorry to hear about the complication." She blinked. That apparently was not what she had expected. "I am looking for work," she said after a moment. "I have experience with bookkeeping, correspondence, and I was trained by my father as a practical nurse, though I hold no formal certificate. I also have 2 years of experience running a household of 12. "What sort of household?" he asked, and there was nothing prurient in the question, only the same careful, genuine interest that he seemed to bring to every subject. She studied him for a moment longer than politeness strictly required. "The kind that did not belong to me," she said finally, and that was all she said about it. Silas Slater asked 3 more questions that night, each one more considered than the last, and none of them were the questions that other men would have asked. He did not ask about her husband. He did not ask what had happened to make her travel alone across the Texas scrubland with everything she owned in a single satchel. He did not ask whether she had family who might be looking for her, the way men asked that question when they were really asking whether someone had a claim on her already. He asked whether she had eaten. He asked whether she knew how to ride, and he asked, with the same level sincerity with which he might have asked about the weather, whether she was all right. The third question was the one that undid her just slightly, just enough that she had to press her lips together briefly before she answered. "I have been better," she said, "but I believe I will be again." "Good," he said, as if that settled something important. Then he told her about the room above Hadley's store, which had a window that faced east and a decent lock on the door, and he paid for another glass of water for her before he left because it was the kind of thing he would have done for anyone without thinking about it, which somehow made it mean more rather than less. Florence Conley stood at the bar of the Silver Spur Saloon and watched the tall rancher with the thoughtful eyes walk out into the dusty evening, and she felt, for the first time in longer than she could precisely calculate, something tentatively and carefully like the possibility of being somewhere she might stay. She had not stayed anywhere in 2 years. The room above Hadley's general store was exactly as Silas had described it. Small, clean by the standards of a frontier town in 1882, with a brass-framed bed, a washstand, a pine table with a single chair, and a window that faced east and let in the morning light in a long, warm band that fell across the floorboards and made the whole room feel like something was beginning rather than ending. Florence unpacked her satchel with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done it many times. 2 dresses, in addition to the one she wore. A small tin of medicinal herbs her mother had pressed into her hands when she was 16, alongside the instruction that a woman who knew how to heal herself would never be entirely without resources. A journal, well worn, its cover soft as skin. A set of ledger books, their spines reinforced with thin strips of leather she had added herself to prevent them from cracking. A photograph, which she placed face down on the pine table without looking at it. She sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her hands flat against her thighs and breathed. Her husband, Thomas Conley, had been dead for 14 months. He had not been a cruel man, exactly, though she had come to understand that the absence of cruelty was not the same as the presence of kindness. He had been a man of property and certainty, which had seemed to a 22-year-old woman raised in a modest household in San Antonio like the foundation of a good life. What it had turned out to be in practice was the foundation of a life in which she was expected to be useful without being seen, present without being heard, and grateful without being asked what she was grateful for. When he died of a fever in the spring of 1881, she had grieved him. She had grieved the loss of him, and also, more privately and more persistently, the loss of all the years she would never recover. His family, the Conleys of Galveston, had opinions about what a widow of 25 should do with herself, and those opinions involved remaining in the large house on Strand Street, managing the household staff, and waiting to be married off to some suitable gentleman of their choosing in the fullness of time. Florence had thanked them for their consideration and taken everything that was legally hers, which amounted to the contents of the battered satchel, a small amount of money from an account her father had set up in her name before he passed, and an absolute certainty that the next chapter of her life would be written on her own terms or not at all. She had been moving west for nearly a year, taking work where she could find it, an estimable woman in one household who needed a skilled nurse for her elderly mother, then a trading post outside of Austin that needed accurate books. She was never in one place long enough to be asked the deeper questions, the ones she had answers for now, the ones she had been assembling in the long months of movement like pages of a document she was not yet sure how to present. Redemption Creek had been a random choice born of a broken wheel on the stage she had been riding. The stage company fixed the wheel in 3 days. Florence was still here 2 weeks later because something about the town felt possible in a way that was difficult to name. She was still trying to name it when she next encountered Silas Slater, which happened 3 days after their first meeting, in the thin early morning light outside Hadley's store, where she was helping old Clem Hadley lift a crate of dry goods that had been delivered and left blocking the doorway. Silas arrived on horseback and swung down with the ease of a man who had spent more hours in a saddle than out of one, and was not particularly impressed by either state. He tied his horse to the post, saw what was happening, and without a word or a wasted motion, he took the other end of the crate from Clem and helped carry it inside. "I had it," Clem said, which was not entirely true. "I know you did," Silas said, which was a kindness rather than a lie. He straightened and found Florence watching him from the doorway with that direct, measuring gaze that he was already coming to recognize as simply the way she looked at things she was genuinely interested in. "Good morning, Mrs. Conley," he said. "Good morning, Mr. Slater. You are up early for a man of property." "The cattle are not interested in my schedule," he said. "I was in town to speak with the feed merchant. He has been shorting my orders by a quarter weight for the past 3 months and seems to believe I have not noticed. And you have." "I keep accurate records," he said, and something shifted in his expression, a slight brightening when he added, "I hear you do as well." She had, in fact, spent the past 2 days reviewing Clem Hadley's inventory ledgers as a favor to the old man who had sharp eyes for people and not much patience for numbers. Word traveled fast in a small town. "Hadley talks," she said. "Everyone in Redemption Creek talks," Silas agreed. "It is the primary occupation after cattle ranching and complaining about the weather." What he said specifically was that you found a 6-month discrepancy in his accounts that he had not known about, and that it explained 3 things that had been confusing him since October. Florence felt the corner of her mouth lift slightly. The discrepancy was not dramatic. Someone had simply been recording incoming stock in the wrong column, which made it appear that goods were missing when they had simply been miscategorized. "Would you be willing to take a look at my ranch's accounts?" Silas asked. She looked at him steadily. "That depends on your terms. Fair wage, paid weekly. You would work at the ranch 3 mornings a week, more if needed. Full access to the ledgers without restriction. I would not tell you what conclusions to reach." "That last condition is unusual," she said. "I have found that paying someone for their knowledge and then overriding it is the most expensive kind of foolishness there is," he said. Florence considered him with the particular quality of attention she gave things that surprised her. "I accept your terms," she said. "When would you like me to begin?" "Monday would suit," he said. "I will have someone ride you out." It is 4 miles and the road is reasonable this time of year. I can ride, she reminded him. He did not look surprised. Monday then, he said, and settled his hat back on his head and untied his horse with the same unhurried economy of movement that seemed to characterize everything he did. Florence watched him go and felt again that complicated and cautious thing that she had not felt in a long time, the quiet, specific interest of one intelligent person recognizing another. The Slater Ranch was called the Crescent Creek, named for the shape of the creek that cut through the northern pastures in a long, graceful curve that caught the morning light in a way that had apparently struck Silas's father, Edmund Slater, as worth immortalizing in the name of the place he had built from nothing in the 1860s. Edmund Slater had died in 1876 of a heart that gave out without warning on a Tuesday morning while he was mending fence line, and Silas had been running the ranch alone since he was 26 years old. Florence learned all of this on her first Monday morning from Rosa Medina, the woman who had cooked and managed the ranch house for the Slater family for 15 years, and who had the quality, common to people who had watched a household from the inside for a long time, of understanding everything about the people in it while appearing to simply be concerned with the biscuits. Rosa was a compact, dark-eyed woman in her early 40s who had come to the Crescent Creek as a young woman with her husband, Pedro, who now served as the ranch's head hand. They had 3 children, 2 of whom still lived on the property, and they treated the ranch with the specific combination of ownership and service that comes from having built something alongside someone for long enough that the distinction between what is yours and what is theirs becomes a matter of perspective rather than legal title. Rosa showed Florence to the office, which was a room off the main hall of the ranch house, with bookshelves covering 2 walls and a large oak desk that was covered, in a combination of deliberate organization and creative chaos, that Florence recognized immediately as the work of someone very intelligent who had not had help with the organizational part. The ledgers were stacked in order on the left side of the desk. She found them to be meticulously accurate in their recording and somewhat idiosyncratic in their structure, which was to say that Silas Slater missed nothing, but organized everything in a system that appeared to be entirely his own invention, based on a logic that she had to spend the first morning simply decoding before she could begin working within it. She was still decoding it when Silas himself came in at mid-morning, smelling of horses and dust, and stopped in the doorway when he saw the 3 ledgers laid out across the desk in a fan pattern alongside the 2 pages of notes she had made for herself. "You are mapping the system," he said. "Your system is functional but not transferable," she said, not looking up. "If anything happened to you, no one else would be able to read these books." There was a brief pause. "That is a practical concern that has not previously been raised with me," he said. "Because it is not a flattering thing to point out," she said, and did look up then to find him watching her with that particular expression. She was starting to recognize, focused and slightly pleased, the look of a man who had asked a question and received an answer that was better than the one he expected. "What would you propose?" he asked. "Keep your system for the daily work since you will not change it and it would be foolish to try. Build a secondary index, a translation document that maps your categories to standard accounting practice. Then anyone with basic bookkeeping knowledge could follow the records if needed. How long would that take? A week if I work efficiently, 2 if I am being thorough." "Be thorough," he said. He brought her coffee then, which she had not asked for, and set it on the corner of the desk without interrupting her work. The coffee was good, stronger than she was used to but not bitter, and she drank it while she worked and felt, in a way she did not immediately examine, entirely comfortable in this room in a way she had not felt comfortable in a space in a very long time. The weeks settled into a rhythm. 3 mornings a week she rode out to the Crescent Creek, more often as the work expanded, because what had appeared to be a straightforward bookkeeping arrangement revealed itself to be something considerably more complex. The Slater Ranch was thriving by the rough standards of West Texas in 1882, but it was operating at a level of productive inefficiency that added up to a meaningful amount of wasted money over the course of a year. Florence found it and documented it, and presented it to Silas in a clear, organized report that did not soften the findings or dress them up with apology. He read every page of her report sitting across from her at the oak desk, and he did not interrupt, did not dismiss, did not redirect her. He asked questions when he reached things he did not understand, and the questions were, every one of them, the exact right questions. Not the questions designed to challenge the findings or protect a prior conclusion, the questions of someone who genuinely wanted to understand. "You are not defensive about this," she observed when he had finished. He looked up from the last page. "Why would I be defensive about accurate information? Most people do not like being told they have been doing something wrong." "I have not been doing anything wrong," he said. "I have been doing things without full information." Those are different problems with different solutions. She thought about that for a long moment. That is a more useful distinction than most people make. "My father used to say that the most expensive thing on a ranch was the thing you did not know you were doing," Silas said. "I think he was right, and I think the principle extends well beyond ranching." The late April light was coming through the office window in the long, slanted way that meant it was past noon, and Rosa appeared in the doorway to indicate that dinner was on the table if they wanted it. Silas looked up, seemed briefly to be performing some internal calculation, and said, "Will you stay for dinner, Mrs. Conley?" Florence had reasons to say no. She had said no the 2 previous times he had asked, citing other obligations that were not entirely false. But on this particular Tuesday in late April, with the afternoon light doing what it was doing and the comfortable residue of 2 hours of genuinely interesting work still warm in her chest, she found that the reasons to say no felt smaller than they usually did. "Yes," she said. "Thank you." Rosa's dinner was a revelation. She cooked with the casual mastery of someone who had never thought of cooking as an art, because she had always simply been its practitioner. And the food was honest and satisfying, and flavored with things that Florence could not entirely identify, but wanted to eat slowly to have more time to appreciate. They ate at the kitchen table, which was where Silas always ate rather than the formal dining room, and the conversation moved in the way that conversation moves between 2 people who have discovered that they are genuinely interested in the same things. They talked about the ranch and about the accounts, but they also talked about the drought conditions that were being reported further west and what they might mean for the cattle trade, and about a book Silas had recently finished, A Natural History of the American Plains, that he had strong opinions about, and about the railroad's expansion and whether it was likely to reach Redemption Creek within the next 2 years, which was a topic that had opinions on all sides in a frontier town. Florence contributed to all of it with the ease of someone who had been reading widely and thinking carefully for years, and had not, until recently, had much occasion to do either of those things out loud. Silas listened to everything she said the way he read the pages of her report, with full attention and without the particular quality of distracted waiting that characterized the listening of people who were only passing time until it was their turn to speak again. It was, Florence thought privately, the most consistently respectful thing about him, and it was more affecting than she had expected it to be. After dinner, Rosa's youngest daughter, Anna, who was 10 and had the bold curiosity common to children who grow up on working ranches, climbed onto the bench beside Florence and asked her about the pin on her collar, which was a small carved ivory bird that had been her mother's. Florence unpinned it and let Anna hold it and told her about her mother, a woman named Clara who had been born in Georgia and had come to Texas as a young woman with her family, and had been, Florence said simply, the sort of person who made a room feel larger just by being in it. Silas watched from across the table, his coffee cup in his hands, and his expression had something in it that Florence did not see until she glanced up. Something quiet and careful and warm. The look of someone who was seeing something they had not expected and were choosing, quite deliberately, not to look away from. She looked away herself, gently, and reattached the pin to Anna's collar so that the girl could see it in the mirror on the kitchen wall, and the moment passed, but it did not entirely dissipate. May arrived with the kind of warmth that in Texas was a preview of the heat to come rather than a thing to be appreciated in itself, and with it came two developments that changed the shape of Florence's days at the Crescent Creek. The first was that the feed merchant in town, a man named Gerald Prout, who had been shorting orders for at least 2 years based on Florence's examination of the records, was confronted by Silas with specific, documented evidence of the discrepancy. Prout, faced with the kind of precise accounting that left no room for the usual vague denials, agreed to compensate the ranch for the shortfall. He was not happy about it, and made his unhappiness clear in the way that men of small authority often do, by redirecting it toward the woman he perceived as responsible for his discomfort. He came to Hadley's store one afternoon while Florence was there and said, in the carrying tone of someone who wants an audience for their grievance, that certain outsiders with uncertain histories would do better to keep their noses out of the affairs of people who had built this town, and that a widow woman who went through a man's private accounts was not the sort of person decent people wanted around their families. Clem, Hadley told him to get out of his store. Florence, who had not said a word during this exchange, finished making her purchase, thanked Clem, and left. She did not tell Silas about it. She had heard worse, and she would not have her composure shaken by Gerald Prout, who was a small man in every way that mattered. Silas heard about it anyway, because Redemption Creek was a small town and Rose's husband Pedro was in Hadley's that afternoon buying nails. Silas rode into town the following morning and had a brief, private conversation with Prout that no one overheard, but that seemed, based on Prout's subsequent behavior, to have been conducted in the quiet, certain register of a man who does not need to raise his voice, because the weight of what he is saying is sufficient. Prout did not bother Florence again. She found out what Silas had done not from him and not from Pedro, but from a chance remark of Rose's, delivered with the casual completeness of someone reporting a fact rather than performing a kindness. Mr. Slater told Prout that the next time he spoke about you in that manner, he would move his business to the merchant in Dorado Falls, Rosa said, which would cost Prout enough that his wife would notice, and Mrs. Prout notices everything. Florence sat with this information for a moment. He did not tell me he did that. No, Rosa agreed, and said nothing more, in the way of a woman who has made her point and does not need to elaborate. The second development in May was the arrival in Redemption Creek of a man named Dale Conley. Florence was in the ranch office when she heard Rosa talking to someone at the door, and the sound of the name, spoken in Rosa's careful, neutral tone as she confirmed whether the visitor was expected, hit Florence like a hand pressed flat against her sternum. She was standing by the time Rosa appeared in the office doorway. "There is a man asking for you," Rosa said. "He says he is your brother-in-law." Florence set down the ledger she had been holding. "Yes," she said, with a steadiness that cost her something. "I will speak with him outside." Dale Conley was Thomas's youngest brother, 28 years old, with the Conley family's broad shoulders and their particular quality of confident certainty that could read as charm, until you understood that it was not especially interested in the responses it provoked. He was well dressed for the frontier, which meant he had traveled with intent rather than necessity, and he looked at the Crescent Creek Ranch with the assessing eye of someone calculating its value. "Florence," he said, and the warmth in his voice was practiced and thin, "we have been worried about you. I sent letters," she said. "Your mother knows I am well." "A letter is not the same as knowing where a person is," he said. "There are matters to discuss regarding Thomas's estate." She knew what this was. The Conley family estate lawyers had sent 2 letters since the previous fall, each one couched in the language of helpfulness and concern, each one aimed at the same destination: the suggestion that Florence's portion of Thomas's estate had been incorrectly apportioned, and that a review of certain documents might reveal a different picture of what she was rightfully owed. Florence was not a woman who required a third explanation of a pattern she had already understood. "I have reviewed the estate documents," she said. "I am satisfied with the settlement." "Florence, there are complications you may not be aware of," Dale said, with the patient condescension of someone explaining something simple to someone they have decided is not very bright. "I am aware of all the complications," she said. "I kept the books for your family's household for 3 years, Dale. I am aware of every account and every holding and every arrangement that touches the estate. Whatever your lawyers believe they have found in the documents, I am prepared to discuss it with my own legal counsel." Dale's expression shifted. The practiced warmth thinned further. "You do not have legal counsel." "I have a recommendation for an attorney in San Antonio," she said, "and the capacity to write a letter." She heard boots on the porch boards then, and Silas Slater's voice, calm and unhurried, from the doorway of the ranch house. "Everything all right?" He was not asking in a theatrical way. He was not squaring his shoulders or positioning himself for effect. He simply stood in the doorway and asked, and the question was directed entirely at Florence, not at Dale, which meant that what mattered to him was her answer, and not the opportunity to involve himself in something that had nothing to do with him. "Yes," Florence said. "My brother-in-law was leaving." Dale looked at Silas, and Silas looked at Dale with the patient, settled quality of a man who has all the time in the world and no particular agenda, which was more unnerving, Florence knew, than any kind of outright hostility. "I will be in town through Friday," Dale said to Florence. "I hope you will think carefully about this." "I think carefully about most things," Florence said. "It is one of my better qualities." Dale left. Florence stood on the porch of the Crescent Creek Ranch house and watched him ride back toward town, and she pressed her hands against the porch railing and breathed through the residual tremor that she would not have anyone see if she could help it. Silas came to stand beside her at a respectful distance and did not say anything for a moment. "He came on behalf of your husband's family," Silas said, "not a question." "His family disputes the settlement of the estate," Florence said. She turned to look at him directly. "I want to be plain with you. I did not come to Redemption Creek as part of any design. The stage broke a wheel. I needed work. That is the entire story." "I have never believed otherwise," Silas said. "And even if the stage had not broken a wheel, it would not change the quality of your work or the character I have come to know in you. People arrive places for all kinds of reasons. What they do when they get there is the part that matters." Florence looked at him for a long moment. The late morning was warm and the light was good, and somewhere in the southern pasture, a cow was calling for her calf in that long, patient way that carries across open land. "He will go through the town records," she said. "He will try to establish that I have property here or arrangements that could be used to argue that I have resettled my life in a way that voided certain provisions of Thomas's will." "Does the will have such provisions?" "No, but the Conley family lawyers are creative men." "Then you need to write to that attorney in San Antonio today," Silas said, "and I will ask Jake Brennan, who is the nearest thing to a legal mind in this county, to review any document that requires attention before it is sent." Florence opened her mouth to say that she was not asking for his help. Silas looked at her with those calm, golden-brown eyes and said, "You did not ask. I am offering. There is a difference." She closed her mouth. There was, she acknowledged, a difference. They went back inside and she wrote the letter to the attorney in San Antonio, and Silas provided the paper and the pen, and did not read over her shoulder, and brought her more coffee without being asked. Dale Conley was in town through Friday. He had one further conversation with Florence, this time at the boarding house where she had now taken a room at Mrs. Calloway's, which had opened up as predicted. He presented her with a document from the Conley estate lawyers, which she accepted without reading in his presence, thanked him for his trouble, and closed the door of her room with a finality that left nothing ambiguous. The document was, as she had expected, a collection of creative reinterpretation dressed up in legal language. The San Antonio attorney, a man named Theodore Park, who replied with impressive speed for someone 200 miles distant, confirmed that it had no legal standing and could be dismissed with a single well-constructed letter. Florence wrote that letter herself, based on Park's outline, and sent it with the next stage going east. Dale Conley rode out of Redemption Creek on Saturday morning, and Florence watched him go from the window of her room and felt a door close with a satisfying finality. She sat down on the bed and let herself be quiet for a long time. Then she went downstairs, saddled the horse she had recently purchased with 3 weeks of wages, and rode the 4 miles to the Crescent Creek Ranch to finish the work she had started on Thursday. June in West Texas was not a thing to be trifled with, and Florence had not been there long enough to have a full accounting of what summer meant in that particular stretch of country. The heat arrived with the conviction of something that has been waiting and is now done waiting, and it remade the landscape in its own image, bleaching the grasses to pale gold, pushing the creek levels down, turning the sky a particular shade of brilliant white blue that was beautiful and unforgiving in equal measure. The cattle moved differently in the heat, and the ranch hands moved differently, and the rhythm of work shifted to accommodate the reality that anything requiring serious physical effort was best accomplished before 10 in the morning and after 5 in the evening, with the middle of the day reserved for tasks that could be done in shade. Florence found herself adapting to this rhythm with a naturalness that surprised her. She had spent the past year in a state of constant motion, and the forced slowing of the summer afternoon heat was, she discovered, something her body had been asking for without her knowledge. She was sitting on the covered porch of the ranch house one afternoon in late June, the ranch ledgers spread on her lap and a glass of cool water beside her, when Silas came and sat in the other chair, not directly beside her but angled toward her, the way people position themselves when they have something they are not quite sure yet how to say. She waited because she had learned that Silas Slater arrived at what he wanted to say in his own time and that the time was always worth waiting for. "May I ask you something personal?" he said, which was not how most men in 1882 prefaced a personal question, most of them simply asking and waiting to see what happened. "You may ask," she said, which was not the same as committing to an answer. "What was it like?" he said. "Your marriage." She put the ledger down and looked at the middle distance, at the shimmer of heat above the southern pasture and the dark line of the distant hills. "It was not what I thought it would be," she said finally, which is not, I think, an unusual thing to say. Thomas was not a bad man. He was a man who had been taught that a wife was a kind of property, not in the cruel sense, not in the way that involves meanness, but in the way that involves simple, unexamined assumption. He did not see me. He saw the role I played in his household and he valued that role, and when the role was performed satisfactorily, he was content. She paused. "The trouble is that I was not a role, I was a person. And over time, the distance between being a person and being treated as a role becomes something that is very difficult to live inside of." Silas was quiet. He did not rush to fill the silence with reassurance or redirection. "Did you love him?" he asked. "I think I loved who I hoped he might become," she said. "That is a different thing from loving a person. It took me too long to understand the difference." "How long?" 2 years, she said. "Long enough that by the time I understood it, we had settled into what we were and I did not see a way to change it without losing everything I had. So I adapted. I became very good at being useful, at understanding his accounts and running his household and making decisions that kept things running smoothly in ways he never examined closely enough to notice." She looked down at the ledgers in her lap. "And then he died, and I had all of that capability and no idea what to do with it." "You rode west," Silas said. "I rode west," she agreed. "Which was the right decision, it was just lonely. The word landed simply between them without performance or appeal for sympathy, just the accurate naming of a true thing. "Yes," Silas said, and the single word carried the weight of a man who understood loneliness from the inside and did not need to elaborate on it. Florence looked at him. "What about you?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I was engaged once," he said. "In 1879. A woman named Catherine Marsh from a good family in Austin. She was a fine person. We suited each other in theory. But I think we were both responding to the social expectation of marriage more than we were responding to each other, and we were both honest enough to see it eventually. We ended the engagement by mutual agreement in 1880, which caused a considerable amount of talk." "I imagine it did," Florence said. "The talk did not bother me much," he said. "What bothered me was the recognition that I had been moving towards something without examining whether I actually wanted it. I have been more careful since then about the difference between what is expected and what is genuine." Florence considered this. "That is an unusual kind of self-knowledge for anyone," she said, "and particularly for a man of your position in a place like this, where people generally want you to be exactly what they expect you to be." "I have never been very good at being exactly what people expect me to be," he said, and there was a slight, dry humor in it. "No," she agreed, and the corner of her mouth curved. "I have noticed that." They sat in the afternoon heat for a while after that, not talking, but not in the uncomfortable way. In the way of two people who have arrived somewhere together and are in no hurry to leave. July brought something unexpected, as July in frontier Texas often did. A family arrived in Redemption Creek. A man named Samuel Webb, his wife Clara, and their 4 children, traveling from Missouri and intending to settle land east of town. Samuel Webb had an injury to his left hand from a wagon accident on the road, a deep cut that had been inadequately treated, and was showing signs of infection that Florence recognized immediately with the practiced eye of her father's teaching. She was in town when they arrived, and she went to them directly, not asking anyone's permission, and examined the hand, and told Samuel with quiet, clear certainty that the infection needed to be treated within the next 2 days, or it would spread in a way that he would find extremely difficult to recover from. Samuel's wife, Clara, who was not the same Clara as Florence's mother but shared a similar quality of quiet practical competence, looked at Florence with the measuring assessment of a woman trying to determine whether to trust a stranger's judgment on a matter of genuine consequence. "I have medical training," Florence said to her. "My father was a physician in San Antonio. I know what I am looking at." Clara looked at her husband. Samuel, who was trying not to show how much his hand was hurting him, nodded once. Florence spent that afternoon and the following morning cleaning and treating the wound with the supplies from her own medicine kit, supplemented by herbs she had purchased from Hadley's and a sterile dressing that she prepared with more care than was strictly observable, but that made a meaningful difference in the outcome. She checked on Samuel daily for a week. The infection receded. The hand healed cleanly. Samuel Webb shook her hand with his good one afterward and said, "I don't know what we would have done without you, ma'am." "You would have found a way," Florence said, because she believed that people generally did. But the Webb family stayed in Redemption Creek, settled their land east of town, and Clara Webb became the first close friend Florence had made since she left San Antonio, a friendship grounded in the particular quality of mutual recognition that happens between 2 intelligent women who have both navigated the world on their own terms. They met for coffee on Tuesday afternoons when Florence was not at the ranch, and they talked with the specificity and the freedom of women who have no audience they are performing for. It was Clara who said on a Tuesday in mid-July without particular preamble, "That rancher of yours is in love with you." Florence looked at her coffee cup. "He is not my rancher." "He is not technically your rancher," Clara agreed, "in the way that the sun is not technically your sun. It does not change the direction it rises in." Florence was quiet. "You know it," Clara said, not unkindly. "I suspect it," Florence said carefully. "That is different from knowing it." "It is different," Clara agreed. "What do you suspect about yourself?" Florence set her coffee down and pressed her fingertips to the table edge and thought about the morning light in the ranch office, and the coffee that appeared at the corner of the desk without being requested, and the question asked on a covered porch in the June heat with the same level, undefended honesty of a man who had stopped performing anything. She thought about the way her chest felt when she rode the 4 miles out to the Crescent Creek, which was not the same as the way her chest felt when she rode it back. "That I am not as cautious as I thought I was," she said. Clara Webb smiled, which was the smile of a woman who has been married long enough and happily enough that she finds the approach of love in other people straightforwardly delightful. "Good," she said. August arrived with a thunder that was both meteorological and practical. A drought that had been building in the western counties finally made itself felt in Redemption Creek, cutting the creek levels lower than they had been since 1878, which was the year that several ranches east of town had lost significant portions of their herds to the dry conditions. The grass in the northern pastures was thinning, and Silas was in a sustained conversation with himself, and with Pedro, and with the land itself about what needed to move, what needed to stay, and what needed to change before the conditions became critical. Florence understood the drought's impact on the accounts immediately and adjusted the projections accordingly, revising the ledgers to reflect the changed conditions and presenting Silas with 3 possible scenarios for the coming months, based on different assumptions about when the rain would return. He read all 3 scenarios with the same focused attention he brought to everything, and asked her which one she thought was most likely. "The middle one," she said. "The drought will break before October. There will be meaningful loss in the northern pastures, but the herd loss will be manageable if you move the cattle in the next 2 weeks. What makes you say before October? The cloud patterns over the western hills for the past 10 days, she said, and what Samuel Webb told me about the conditions he traveled through coming from the north. There is moisture building. It is slow, but it is coming." Silas looked at her for a long moment. "You have been watching the clouds. Watching things is useful," she said simply. He smiled at that, the full, genuine smile that he did not produce often and that, when it arrived, changed his face in a way that Florence had given up pretending not to notice. It was not a charming smile in the calculated sense. It was a happy smile, the straightforward expression of a man who has encountered something that pleases him, which was, she had concluded privately, considerably more affecting than charm. "Will you ride out with me tomorrow morning?" he asked. "I want to look at the northern pastures and think through where to move the herd. I would benefit from your reading of what you see." She had not ridden the northern pastures before. She had stayed within the operational radius of the ranch house and the office, which was the appropriate boundary for someone in her professional role. This was something different, and they both knew it. "Yes," she said, "I will ride with you." The northern pastures were beautiful in the specific way of landscape under pressure, the pale gold grass catching the early light, the distant line of the hills blue-purple against the clear sky, the creek reduced to a silver thread winding through the pale earth but still there, still moving. Florence and Silas rode side by side with a comfortable pace and talked about the land and the herd and the conditions. And then, as the morning opened up around them, about other things. He told her about his father, who had built the Crescent Creek from nothing in the years after the war, a man of enormous energy and specific vision who had also been, Silas said, difficult to actually know in the way that very driven men are sometimes difficult to know because their attention is always partly somewhere else. Florence told him about her father, the physician, who had been exactly the opposite, a man whose attention was never anywhere other than where he was, whose capacity for presence had been his most extraordinary quality. He listened to everyone the same way, she said, whether it was a banker or a field hand. He thought that every person had something worth understanding, and he was right. Silas looked at her. "You listen like that too," he said. She was quiet for a moment, surprised in the specific way of finding out that something you thought was private has been visible. "My father's influence," she said. "Mine too," Silas said, "though I came to it later." I spent a long time thinking that the loudest voice in a room was the most useful one. I was about 25 before I started understanding that the most useful voice was the one asking the right question. Florence looked at him across the pale grass and the morning light. "What changed your mind?" He thought about this. "A conversation with a Comanche elder named Toanisi, who came through here in the summer of 1875, before the territory was formally settled," he said. "He spoke almost no English and I spoke almost no Comanche, and we spent 3 hours sharing a meal on the bank of this creek, communicating almost entirely through gesture and patience. And at the end of it, I understood more about this land and the water table, and the way the grass would behave in dry years than I had learned in 25 years of growing up on it." He was gone the next morning, and I never saw him again, but I have thought about that conversation probably every year since. About what it meant that he took the time, and what he was willing to teach a young rancher who mostly didn't know the right questions to ask yet. Florence listened to this and felt something shift in her chest that was not quite the same as the complicated, careful thing from before. It was more settled than that, more certain. "He gave you a gift," she said. "He did," Silas agreed. "I try not to waste it." They rode the northern pastures for 2 hours, and Florence read the land with the combined logic of her father's training in careful observation, and her own year of watching and listening, and the specific attention she had been paying to this particular place. She told Silas what she thought and why she thought it, and he listened and asked questions and sometimes disagreed, and explained why, and they arrived together at a plan for the herd movement that neither of them would have reached alone. On the ride back to the ranch house, they were quiet for a while, riding close enough that their horses' shoulders were almost touching, in the easy way of people who have stopped performing distance they do not feel. It was Silas who stopped his horse at the top of the rise that looked back over the northern pastures, and Florence stopped beside him, and they sat there in the morning light with the whole of the Crescent Creek spread out below them. "Florence," he said, and the way he said her given name, which he had not used before, with the careful, certain quality of someone who has thought about a thing from many angles and has arrived at the right moment to say it, made her heart do something complicated. She looked at him. "I'm not going to pretend that this is about the accounts," he said. "I hope you know that I respect you too much for that kind of indirection." "I do know that," she said. "I would like to ask you to dinner," he said. "Not at the ranch. In town properly, so that there is no ambiguity about what I am asking." She was quiet for a long moment. "I am not in a hurry," he added, because he was the kind of man who added that and meant it. "I am simply asking. You can take whatever time you need to decide." Florence looked at him in the morning light, at the honest, patient face of a man who had spent the better part of 2 years developing the right questions to ask, and thought about all the answers she had been carrying. "I do not need a great deal of time," she said. "Yes." The dinner at Redemption Creek's only proper restaurant, a place called the Continental House that was continental only in the broadest possible sense, but served a decent beef roast and had tablecloths, was attended with the full notice of a small town that had been quietly watching 2 people for the better part of 6 months, and had various opinions about what they were eventually going to do. Florence wore her best dress, the deep blue one that she had brought with her from San Antonio and worn only twice since arriving in Redemption Creek, and she had done something more deliberate with her hair, and she was, in the privacy of her own room before she left, entirely aware that she was nervous in the good way rather than the fearful way, which was a distinction she had not had occasion to make for a very long time. Silas was already at the table when she arrived, and he stood when she came in, because it was the kind of thing he always did, and he looked at her with the undisguised warmth of a man who has decided to be exactly where he is and is glad of it. And Florence felt the last remaining caution she had been keeping as a standing reserve simply release, quietly and completely. They talked through 3 courses, and a dessert that neither of them particularly wanted, but that gave them an excuse to keep sitting there. And the talk moved from easy to warm to honest, and then to something that was all of those things at once. They talked about what they both wanted. Not in the abstract, not through the politely indirect language that the social customs of 1882 generally required, but in the plain, direct, careful language of two people who have decided that they have been in enough situations where the indirect approach led somewhere that did not serve them. He wanted the ranch to be a home rather than just a business. He wanted to understand things. He wanted to keep asking questions even when the questions were uncomfortable, because that was the only way he had ever learned anything worth knowing. And he wanted, he said, with a straightforwardness that was not uncaring but was simply his, someone to ask the questions with. Florence listened and thought, and said that what she wanted was to use what she was and what she knew in a way that was genuinely hers, not in service of someone else's vision or expectation, but as a full participant in whatever the work was. She wanted to be seen, not in the way of being admired or appreciated as a role, but in the way of being actually perceived, the whole person, the questions alongside the answers, the parts that were comfortable alongside the parts that were still complicated. "I see you," Silas said, in the same quiet, certain way he said everything. "I have been seeing you since the first night in the Silver Spur." Florence pressed her lips together briefly. "Satchel," she said. "The way you held it," he said. She felt the warmth rise in her face and did not look away from it. "I did not know anyone would notice that. Most people would not," he said. "But I have always been interested in the things that nobody else asks about." She looked at him across the Continental House's slightly uneven tablecloth with the lamplight between them and the sound of a West Texas summer night coming through the open windows, and she said, "I am glad you asked about me." "So am I," he said, "more than almost anything else." September came with the relief of cooler air, and as Florence had predicted from the cloud patterns and Samuel Webb's account of conditions to the north, rain. It came in the second week, steady and thorough, a 3-day rain that settled the dust and raised the creek level and put color back in the grass of the northern pastures and made the whole of Crescent Creek smell like something beginning again. Silas and Florence stood on the covered porch of the ranch house on the first evening of the rain and watched it come down with the shared satisfaction of people whose predictions have proved accurate, and who have the further satisfaction of knowing that the predictions were based on careful, serious attention to the world rather than luck. "You were right," Silas said. "We were right," Florence said. "I would not have read it as clearly without knowing what you had told me about how the land had behaved in previous dry years." He looked at her sideways, which was something she had come to find endearing, the particular angle at which he looked at things that surprised him. "You always do that," he said. "Do what? Distribute the credit to everyone who contributed to the outcome." She considered this. "Is that unusual?" "In my experience," he said, "yes." She was quiet for a moment, watching the rain track down the porch railing in thin, clean lines. "My father used to say that the only thing worse than a person who takes all the blame is a person who takes all the credit. The truth of most things is a shared project." The rain continued. He moved slightly closer, not dramatically, just the small shift of a person crossing the last comfortable distance between themselves and the person they have chosen. "I love you," he said in the plain, considered way of a man for whom the statement was the result of long, careful thought and was not going to be qualified or performed. "I want you to know that clearly, so there is no ambiguity." Florence turned to look at him fully. The rain was loud and clean on the porch roof, and the lamp in the house behind them made a warm rectangle of light against the evening, and she had in this moment all the answers she had been assembling for 2 years, all the things she knew now about herself and what she needed and what she was capable of giving. "I love you too," she said. "I have been trying to be careful about it because I have not always trusted myself to know the difference between what I feel and what I wish for. But I know the difference now." He reached out and took her hand, and she let him, and they stood in the rain sound and the lamp light in the cool September evening, and the particular quality of the moment was not dramatic in the theatrical sense. It was something better than that. It was the quiet, settled, genuine recognition of two people who had found each other through the specific medium of honest questions and honest answers, and who understood, both of them, what a rare thing that was. Silas Slater asked Florence Conley to marry him on the first day of October, 1882, on the bank of the Crescent Creek on a morning so clear and cool that the hills to the north were visible in details that the summer haze had kept hidden for months. He did not make a production of it. He had the ring in his jacket pocket, a simple gold band with a small turquoise stone set in it, turquoise being a stone he associated with this landscape and this particular stretch of Texas sky, and he asked her in the same direct, honest way he did everything, and she said yes in the same way she said things, which was with the full weight of her consideration and none of the hedging that was really just performance. They were married in November in the small church in Redemption Creek by Pastor Whitmore, who had come to have a particular fondness for Florence based on 3 separate conversations about medicine and faith that had been the best theological discussions he had managed in years. The church was full, because Redemption Creek was a small town and weddings were important, but Florence did not feel the weight of the audience the way she might have once. She felt the morning light coming through the church windows and the warmth of Clara Webb's hand pressed briefly against hers before she walked forward, and the face of the man waiting for her at the front of the room, composed and certain and entirely glad. Rosa cried, which she had told Anna in firm advance she absolutely was not going to do, and Pedro pretended not to notice. The wedding dinner was held at the ranch, which Rosa had spent 3 days preparing for with an energy that suggested she had considerable feelings about the occasion that she was expressing through cooking. The table was long and crowded, and the food was extraordinary, and the evening was full of the particular music of people who are genuinely happy, which is a different and more complete sound than the music of people who are performing happiness. Silas stood with a glass raised and said only a few words, because he was not a man who needed many words when the right ones were available. He said that the best thing that had ever happened to him was a broken stage wheel, and that the second best thing was a woman who had answers to questions he had spent his whole life asking, and that he intended to spend a considerable amount of time asking more of them. Florence looked at him across the table full of people and firelight and the warm smell of Rosa's cooking, and felt something that was not like anything she had felt before, not the cautious hope of the first weeks, not the carefully managed warmth of the summer, but something that had no hedges around it, something open and clear and entirely her own. Winter came to the Crescent Creek with a gentleness that the ranch hands said was unusual, cold but not brutal, the kind of weather that allowed the land to rest without punishing the people trying to live on it. Florence settled into the ranch house not with the provisional quality of someone trying it out, but with the complete, comfortable certainty of someone who has arrived at the right place. She kept the accounts, not because she needed to prove her usefulness, but because she was genuinely good at it, and because the work mattered to the ranch, and because she and Silas had arrived, naturally and without needing to negotiate it formally, at a way of working together that used what they each were good at without requiring either of them to subordinate themselves to the other. He understood the land and the cattle and the physical logistics of running 2,000 acres in West Texas. She understood the numbers and the patterns and the correspondence and the medical needs of the 30-odd people who lived and worked on the property. Both of those things mattered. Both of them knew it. She began, in the winter months, to build something she had been thinking about since the Webb children arrived in Redemption Creek, and she realized that there was no school within reasonable reach of the families settling in the eastern land. She wrote letters to the State Education Board, which was not a particularly responsive body in 1882 Texas, and she organized the interested parents, which turned out to be nearly every family within 5 miles, and she conducted informal classes in the ranch house on Saturday mornings, which began with 7 children and by February had 13. Silas cleared a room near the main hall for the purpose, built in 2 additional bookshelves, and acquired, through a contact in San Antonio, a collection of educational texts that were considerably more current than anything the families had brought with them. He did this without announcing it, and Florence came in one Saturday morning to find the room arranged and the books on the shelves, and went to find him in the office where he was working on the spring breeding schedule. "The room," she said. "It needed to be functional," he said, not looking up from his papers. "Silas." He looked up. "Thank you," she said. "It is your school," he said. "I just made it easier to reach." She crossed the office and kissed him, which was an action she was entirely comfortable with now, and which still, she noticed, produced in him the same quality of focused, complete attention that he brought to things that genuinely mattered to him. He was not, she had established, a man who went through the motions of things. When he was present entirely. "You are going to ruin my breeding schedule," he said, against her hair. "The cattle can wait," she said. The spring of 1883 brought several significant things. The first was that Florence discovered she was carrying a child. She knew before she told Silas, had the quiet, interior knowledge that her father had described to her once as the body's honest announcement of a fact that has not yet been confirmed by any external evidence. And she sat with it for 3 days, not from uncertainty, but from the wish to know it fully herself before she shared it. She thought about her mother and about her father and about the children she had watched grow up in the households she had passed through, and she thought about what she wanted for a child of hers and Silas's, which was the same thing her father had given her: the full and consistent attention of parents who saw her. She told Silas on a Thursday evening in April, sitting in the office where so much of their best conversation had happened, and his face did the thing that it did when he encountered something that genuinely moved him, the slight stilling of everything else, the focused quality of a man turning completely toward the thing that has his full attention. "Are you certain?" he asked. "As certain as a person can be at this stage," she said. "I believe by late October or early November." He was quiet for a long moment, and then he stood up from behind the desk and came around to where she was sitting and took her hands in both of his, and his expression was the full, unguarded version of the smile she had been seeing all year, the one without any reserve in it. "Are you pleased?" He asked, and it was the right question, the question that put her experience and her wishes at the center rather than his own. "Very," she said. "Are you?" "More than I know how to say," he said, which for a man who generally finds words adequate is a significant statement. The second significant thing that spring was the formal establishment of the school, which, through Florence's organized persistence and the petition signed by 37 landowners, received a small grant from the county and the assignment of a proper teacher, a recent graduate of the Huntsville Normal School named Miss Eliza Crane, who arrived in May and took over the Saturday school with such enthusiasm and capability that Florence was able to hand it off with the satisfaction of having built something that could stand on its own. She retained a role in the school's administration, because she was not the kind of person who built things and walked away from them, but the day-to-day teaching was in better hands, which freed her time for other things, including the increasing demands of her own pregnancy and the expansion of the ranch's medical capacity, which she had been quietly developing since the previous summer. The third significant thing was that Clem Hadley offered to sell his store. He was 71 years old, and his hands were giving him trouble, and his son, who he had been expecting to come and take over the business, had written to say he was settling in New Mexico instead, and Hadley had arrived at the considered conclusion that the time had come to let it go. He came to Florence first, which surprised her, and which she later understood, having thought about it, was the result of 2 years of watching her work and the specific confidence of an old man who trusted his own judgment about people. She discussed it with Silas that evening. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table with Rose's coffee between them, and they talked it through with the same quality of attention they brought to the ranch accounts, laying out the practical realities clearly and discussing the implications from multiple directions. Silas's opinion was that it was a sound business opportunity and that the store, under competent management, could generate a reliable supplemental income that was not subject to the same weather-dependent variability as the cattle operation. His further opinion, delivered with the directness that was simply how he operated, was that Florence was one of the most capable business minds he had encountered, and that a woman with her skills running a general store in a growing frontier town was a rational allocation of talent. Florence's opinion was that she wanted to do it, which was, she acknowledged, the most important factor. They purchased Hadley's store in June, and Florence ran it with the same methodical efficiency she brought to everything, reorganizing the inventory system, establishing reliable supply relationships, and developing a side business in the medical supplies that the region's homesteading families consistently needed and could not reliably obtain. The summer of 1883 was the full warmth of a life that had found its shape. Florence was clearly pregnant by July, and she moved through her days with the practical acknowledgement of the physical reality and the complete refusal to be reduced by it, which was not a refusal born of stubbornness, but of the entirely sensible view that pregnancy was a condition of her body, not a suspension of herself. She ran the store through August. She managed the ranch accounts through September. She taught the school's Saturday sessions twice in early October when Miss Crane was ill. Silas watched all of this with a combination of admiration and concern that he navigated by expressing the concern directly and plainly, and accepting her direct, plain response, which was generally that she was fine and knew her own body and would tell him if that changed. When she told him, in early October, that she thought the child would arrive sooner than originally estimated, and that she wanted Clara Webb present when it happened, he had Clara Webb at the ranch the next morning, which involved a pre-dawn ride to the Webb homestead, and a conversation with Samuel that was brief and purposeful in the way of two men who respected each other, and did not require elaboration. The child arrived on the 14th of October, 1883, in the morning, in the ranch house bedroom, with Clara Webb and Rosa Medina and Florence's own calm competence all present, and Silas pacing the kitchen below with Pedro, who had done this 3 times and was therefore the senior authority on the experience of waiting. He was a boy, born with the dark eyes common to newborns, and with a quality of focused attention that Rosa said later was unmistakable from the first hours, the look of a baby who was already watching the room with interest. Florence held him against her chest in the morning light that came through the east-facing window, the same kind of window she had stood at in the room above Hadley's store 18 months ago, and felt the extraordinary, humbling weight of a thing that was entirely new and entirely real. Silas came up when Clara came to the kitchen door, and he sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his wife and his son with the full, complete attention that was the deepest and most characteristic thing about him, and his eyes were bright in a way that Florence had not seen before. "He looks at things," Silas said, wonderingly. "He looks at things exactly the way you do," she said. Silas looked at her then, and the expression on his face was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen, full of love and gratitude, and the quality of a man who has understood, completely and without reserve, that he is exactly where he is meant to be. They named him Edmund James Slater, Edmund for Silas's father and James for Florence's, and he was called Eddie from the first week, because Rosa called him that once, and it stuck with the immediate completeness that nicknames sometimes achieve, and even Silas, who had always used full names, could be heard saying it without apparent awareness. The winter of 1883 was warm, or at least warm by the standards of West Texas, and the ranch house held the quality that houses hold when they are genuinely inhabited, the accumulated warmth of people who belong to each other. Rosa made a cradle quilt from fabric she had been collecting since October, in colors that were, she said, for a child who would grow up watching a beautiful sky, which was true, and which Rosa seemed to feel did not need further explanation. Clara Webb came twice a week with her youngest, and the two women drank coffee, and talked with the free-ranging quality of a friendship that had become one of the central structures of their lives. Florence learned in these months the particular texture of deep happiness, which was not the uncomplicated brightness of youth's optimism, but something more durable and more interesting, a happiness built from known difficulty and honest choice, and the company of people who saw her clearly. She thought sometimes about the woman who had walked into the Silver Spur saloon with a leather satchel pressed against her ribs, scanning the room for threats and exits, and finding none of the faces she knew. She did not feel sorry for that woman. That woman had been necessary. She had been carrying everything she needed even then. She had simply not yet found anyone willing to ask the right questions. The spring of 1884 brought new calves to the Crescent Creek and new families to the land east of town, and a letter from the State Board of Education confirming the establishment of a permanent school building on the property donated by Silas at Florence's request, which was to be called the Crescent Creek School, and was to be open to all children in the district without distinction. It also brought, on a clear April morning, Silas crossing the kitchen with Eddie on his arm and a look of amusement on his face. "I have been asked something," he said. Florence looked up from her correspondence. "By whom?" "By your son," he said, "who cannot yet form questions in recognizable language, but who has been pointing at the window and making an extremely interrogative noise for the past 20 minutes. Eddie, who was 6 months old and had indeed been developing a particular pointed gesture toward things that interested him, made the noise in question, directed now at Florence, with an expression that was the perfect genetic product of the two most curious people in Redemption Creek. She stood and took him from Silas and carried him to the window and showed him the April morning, the new green of the pastures after the winter, the horses moving in the eastern corral, the bright specific blue of the sky above the hills. Eddie looked at all of it with those dark, attentive eyes and made a sound that was not quite a word but was clearly a response. "He has questions," Silas said from behind her. "He will always have questions," Florence said. "He is his father's son." Silas came to stand beside her, and they stood together at the window of the house that was entirely theirs, and the morning was full and clear, and the questions it held were the good kind, the kind that meant more was coming, more of everything that mattered. By the summer of 1884, the Crescent Creek School had 12 students enrolled, taught by Miss Eliza Crane, with Florence maintaining the school's books and sitting on the small board of directors that oversaw its operation. The store on Main Street, now formally called Conley's Mercantile, was turning a reliable profit and had become something more than simply a place to purchase goods. It had become the place where the homesteading women of the region gathered twice a week, formally or otherwise, to talk and to share information, and to support each other in the practical, specific ways that women on the frontier supported each other, which was to say, in every way that mattered. Florence had organized, through the store, a lending library of medical texts and practical housekeeping manuals and general interest books, funded by a small subscription fee that everyone paid because Florence had explained clearly why it was better to pay a small fee than to accept charity, and it was the most used resource in the county east of town. Silas watched all of this with the quiet, settled pride of a man who had made an excellent decision and knew it and was grateful for it every day. He said so regularly because he was a man who had concluded that not saying the things you meant was a waste of the limited time available for saying them. On an evening in August, sitting on the covered porch of the ranch house where they had sat many times now through all the seasons of their life together, with Eddie asleep inside, and the evening moving through its gradual, beautiful colors, he said, "I want to tell you something." Florence looked at him with the calm, full attention that was simply how she listened to him. "When I was 25, sitting at that corner table in the Silver Spur," he said, "I had a habit of watching rooms and thinking that no one I was going to meet there was going to be worth the effort of actually knowing. Not out of cynicism exactly, but because I had not yet found someone who was interested in the same things in the same way. And then you walked in holding that satchel like it held the most important thing in the world, and you asked for a glass of water and information about where to sleep, and you did not ask for anything more. And I thought, for the first time in a long time, that I had finally met someone who was carrying something worth asking about." Florence was quiet for a long moment. The evening air was cool and the sky above the southern pasture was the deep, complicated blue that happened for only 15 minutes at this particular time of day. "I am glad you asked," she said. "So am I," he said, "more than I have words for, and I am a man who generally finds words sufficient." She reached over and put her hand on his, the same way she had taken his hand on the porch in the September rain of their first year, and they sat in the August evening and watched the sky do what the sky of West Texas did in August, which was to put on a display so complete and so excessive and so entirely sure of itself that there was nothing to do but be present for it. The following autumn, Florence discovered she was carrying their second child. This one arrived in May of 1885. A girl with red hair that was clearly from Florence's side of the family and eyes that were already showing signs of the golden brown that would clarify over time into something unmistakably Silas's. They named her Clara Jane Slater, Clara for the friend who had been present at Eddie's birth and Jane for the simple reason that it was a name they both found good. Eddie, who was a year and 7 months old at his sister's arrival, examined her with the focused, interrogative attention that was his most consistent characteristic, and then pointed at her and made the noise that they had long since established was his word for something interesting, which Florence thought was, all things considered, as welcome a welcome as anyone could ask for. The Crescent Creek School had 22 students by the fall of 1885. Clem Hadley, who had retired to a small house on the edge of town, and spent his days on his porch watching the progress of a town he had helped build, told anyone who asked that Florence Conley Slater was the best business mind in the county, and that the county did not deserve her, which he meant as a compliment. Rosa, who had heard this secondhand and reported it to Florence with the satisfaction of a woman sharing good news, also said that Clem had said it in exactly the right company, which was to say in the presence of Gerald Prout, who had been trying to expand his grain business and had run into Florence's far more competent competition. This Florence did not feel sorry about. The winter of 1885 was the best winter the Crescent Creek had had in years. Deep snow in December that filled the creek bed and promised a good spring, cold enough to be beautiful without being cruel. The ranch house was full of the specific warmth of a family life well lived, Eddie making his way through his first words with the systematic commitment of someone working through a list, Clara already showing signs of a ferocious curiosity that suggested she was going to be a person of considerable opinion, and Silas and Florence moving through their shared days with the ease and completeness of people who have built something real together and know its value. On the last night of 1885, with the new year a few hours away and both children asleep and Rosa and Pedro gone home, and the house quiet in the good way, Florence and Silas sat at the kitchen table where they had sat through dozens of conversations that had made them who they were together, and they had a glass of the wine that a merchant in San Antonio had sent as a New Year's gesture, which was a courtesy that would not have come their way in 1882, and which spoke to the distance they had traveled. "What do you want for the new year?" Silas asked, because he was still, after 3 years of marriage, a man who asked questions that other people did not think to ask. Florence considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "I want the school building to be finished by spring," she said. "I want the drought risk assessment we did for the northern pastures to prove unnecessary, which would mean a good wet year. I want Eddie to stop trying to dismantle everything within his reach, at least occasionally. I want Clara to be as healthy at a year as she is today. And I want," she said, looking at him across the kitchen table in the lamplight that had been the light of so many of their best conversations, "exactly what I have." Silas looked at her with the expression that was the full, unguarded version of everything he felt, which was, on the evidence of 3 years of paying attention to it, the most beautiful thing she had ever regularly seen. "That is a good list," he said. "What do you want?" she asked. He thought about it the way he thought about everything, with full attention and without rushing to fill the silence with a lesser answer. "I want to keep asking questions," he said. "And I want to keep having someone who has answers worth hearing." Florence felt the warmth of this settle in her chest with the completeness of something that has found its right place. "You always will," she said. He raised his glass. She raised hers. Outside, the Texas night was clear and cold, and the stars above the Crescent Creek were the dense, particular stars of a sky unpolluted by anything other than itself. And they were, both of them, exactly where they were supposed to be, which was the rarest and most complete form of happiness that either of them had ever known. And they knew it, and they said so. And the new year came in with the sound of the creek running clear and full in the winter dark, patient and purposeful and going exactly where it was going. The school opened its proper building in March of 1886, a white-framed structure with 4 windows on each side, and a bell that Miss Crane rang with such evident pleasure every morning that it had become one of the reliable sounds of the Redemption Creek day. The way the blacksmith's hammer and the stage horn, and the particular call of the mockingbird that nested in the old cottonwood behind the church, were reliable sounds. Florence stood at the dedication with Eddie on her hip and Clara in Silas's arms, and Pastor Whitmore said the words that were appropriate, and the families of 24 enrolled students stood in the thin March sunlight, and Florence thought about all the things that had to happen, every broken wheel and lonely mile and careful question and honest answer, to arrive at this specific morning in this specific place. And she found that she was grateful for all of it, even the hard parts. Because the hard parts were part of the same story as the good parts, and the story was hers, finally and completely, and it was one she had answers for. Silas found her afterward, when the crowd had dispersed, and the children were running across the schoolyard in the loose, purposeful way of children who have discovered a new space, and are performing a systematic investigation of its possibilities. He came and stood beside her and said nothing for a moment, just stood with her and looked at what they had made together, the school and the children and the wide, clear, West Texas morning. "Good," he said finally, which was what he had said to her on the first night in the Silver Spur, when she told him she believed she would be all right again, and which meant from him exactly what it had always meant, which was that the right thing had been said or done, and there was nothing to add to it except the quiet, settled certainty of someone who knows what matters and is glad it exists. Florence leaned into his shoulder briefly, the way she did when she wanted to say something that words were unnecessary for. Eddie appeared at her knee a moment later, pointed at the school bell with maximum urgency, and produced the interrogative noise that was still, at 2.5 years old, his primary mode of inquiry. "That is a bell," Florence told him. He considered this information with the focused seriousness of someone cross-referencing it against existing knowledge. "Bell," he said, which was his third word, and the first of many more that he would spend his whole life finding, in the particular tradition of the family he had been born into, which was the tradition of people who were never quite done asking.